record button, and I'm looking around as people tumble in, and I'll just start the meeting the way I typically do, with a sincere thank you to each of you. I recognize a number of board members joining us. We've also got some guests. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Bob Schmidt, Executive Director here at the Brandis Center at UC San Diego's Rady School of Management. And hopefully we've got another interesting speaker and topic lined up for the day. I mentioned this in the emails that I sent around prior to this meeting. We're going to talk about politics today, hopefully without getting political. And it's really, we're looking at how political partisanship affects decision-making outside of politics, and why maybe that's not such a good idea. And the idea for this event kind of came about a few months ago. Met our guest speaker today, Dr. Joey Engelberg, for a cup of coffee on campus. We were in my office. We were talking about all the research that he's done on partisanship, how it's infiltrated into other aspects of decision-making. And I thought this would be a good topic for a board meeting, especially as we get closer to the presidential election here in the States. So I know Joey today is going to talk about partisanship with respect to entrepreneurship, COVID, applications for patents, and even comparing and contrasting sentiment, I think, among Federal Reserve board members and SEC commissioners. So got a lot of ground to cover. I've set aside 90 minutes. If we need all that time, we'll take it. If not, we'll close the conversation when things kind of dry up. But a couple of housekeeping items, as always, if you would please, if you haven't done so already, please mute yourself. And every time I say that, I have to stress, I really want you to unmute and participate in the conversation. I don't want this to be a one-sided presentation. All of you are really good at that. So feel free to share some comments in the chat, or just, again, take yourselves off mute and share any comments or questions that you might have. And I want to tee up Joey thoughtfully. He's been just a terrific supporter of our work going back for years. I've known him since part-time teaching back at UCSD, going back 6, 7, 8 years. He's been on a number of these calls already. He is a professor of finance and Atkinson Epstein Chair in Management Leadership. Joey earned his PhD in finance from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University, his BA in mathematics and BS in business administration from the University of Southern California. Maybe, Joey, if we have time, we can talk about your Trojans. And it looks like they have a decent defense.
Great victory against LSU, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And holding LSU to 20 points. Usually USC defense gives up 20 points on the opponent's first possession.
Exactly.
So, hey, as I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, Joey's a member of the Brandis Center's Academic Council. And I did mention he's been an ardent supporter of our work over the years. So, Joey, thrilled to have you on the call again today. So feel free to take it from here, my friend.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. So the goal for today is to just talk about, as Bob said, some of my recent research concerning partisanship and finance. Please, as Bob said, please feel free to ask questions throughout. We'll just keep this very, very casual. I'm essentially going to stay pretty big picture on each of the 4 papers. I don't have time to get into a lot of details. There might be 5 or 6 slides on each paper, just to give you the high-level takeaways. I think sort of stepping back and looking at everything I'm going to present today, there's going to be plenty of empirical evidence that the level of political partisanship is at a recent high. I'm going to start with evidence of that. I'm going to talk to you about the new methodologies and data available to finance researchers that are really enabling us to perform this research. There's a really cool language-based approach to identify political partisans. And then recently, data that has been sold to political campaigns by political data vendors. Think about a data set of all 200 million registered voters that sit here today, whether they're Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, Green Party, their political affiliation, and then a lot of other covariates in that data set that's available to finance and economics researchers today. So sort of innovations in methodology and data have really unlocked the ability to do a lot of this research I'm going to share with you. And then, as Bob was saying, I think the big picture evidence is going to be that partisanship seems to be spilling into beliefs and decisions in finance that we wouldn't think of. That's a bit surprising. And as Bob said, throughout you'll see there's going to be no side taking, because I don't think there should be. So I don't think. I'm not going to take a position that Republicans are right or Democrats are right or anything like that. It's going to be sort of marveling at the fact that that partisanship is spilling into these regions where really in principle it shouldn't be there. If we think about stock valuation or valuing any asset, right? We forecast out its cash flows, we figure out what the right discount rate is, we come to a value. My Republicanism or Democratism is completely orthogonal to that, right? Is completely independent of that. If Republican or Democrat values were really important for valuing an asset, I'd probably be teaching it in my class, or it would be on the CFA exam. And it's obviously not. So that's going to be my sort of position throughout. All right, so let's start with the first premise. So I'm sure it feels like this to you. It does to me. It feels like as Americans, things are about as partisan and polarized as they've ever been. You can see this empirically in a lot of different ways through surveys. So here's an example. So Pew runs this survey pretty regularly, where they ask Democrats, Republicans, and independents a series of 10 questions that are meant to identify how liberal or conservative they are. Okay. And so in 1994, when they asked Democrats and Republicans, they got this distribution here, this distribution of blue, this distribution of red, and these two lines, these are the median Democrat and the median Republican in their sample in 1994. And you can see the distance in their political values was not that far apart, okay, in how they answer these 10 questions. So said another way, the median Democrat, the median Republican in a liberal conservative scale were not that different from each other, or even that different than the median independent here in purple. Okay. In 2004, also true. But look what's happened by 2017. Very far apart, right? The median Democrat, the median Republican. Think of these two histograms. They've really been taken to the polar opposites, right? Been really pulled apart. And here's another way to say it. Republicans and Democrats increasingly don't like each other. So in 1994, 21% of Republicans had an unfavorable, very unfavorable view of Democrats. 17% of Democrats had a very unfavorable view of Republicans. This was in 1994. This is Pew surveys. By 2022, these numbers had tripled. So now 62% of Republicans have a very unfavorable view of the other side. 54% of Democrats have a very unfavorable view of the other side. And it's this increasing amount of polarization and partisanship is spilling into our lives, right? There's in places, again, we probably wouldn't like. This is a cool paper by Chen and Rolla in Science in 2018. What they do is the following. They take the entire US and they mark it red and blue by district, by the voting in that district. And they know which district is predominantly Republican, which districts are predominantly Democrat, and they have a bunch of cell phone data. Okay, and so this is another kind of new data revolution, is access to cell phone data. You don't know the person's name who owns the cell phone, so there's a lot of privacy barriers in this cell phone data. However, you can see the geolocation roughly of the cell phone, and for example, where that cell phone pings at 2 a.m. every night. So where your cell phone pings at 2 a.m. every night is probably where you live, right? It's probably where you lay your head at night. And so what Chen and Rolla do is they know the area that these cell phones live. And then on Thanksgiving Day, they follow cell phones that make a day-long trek for Thanksgiving dinner, where it looks like they leave a spot, drive several hours, stay at a spot for several hours, and then drive back home that same day. It looks like, you know, a Thanksgiving Day trek that many of us, I'm sure, make. Okay. Now, you can see where this experiment is going. There are 4 possible treks. You could go from a red district to a red district, right? Your cell phone could. Blue to blue, or you could have mismatches. You could have someone who lives in a red district go to Thanksgiving at a blue district, or someone who lives in a blue district go to Thanksgiving at a red district. Okay. So they compare, for example, a blue going to a red with a red going to a red. So this would be a mismatch, and this would be a match in terms of where you go for Thanksgiving dinner. And what they find is that when you have mismatches, the Thanksgiving dinner is 40 minutes shorter. The time spent is 40 minutes shorter than same party visits in 2016. And so the takeaway from the paper is a nationwide 34 million person hours of cross-partisan Thanksgiving discourse were lost in 2016 to partisan effects. That's what they estimate. So again, a neat paper, but another illustration of partisanship spilling into pockets of our lives. Okay, before I get into how it's spilling into various finance areas, let me talk about one innovation that I'm going to use for 2 papers, which is measuring partisanship with language. So this comes from a very famous paper by 2 economists, Matt Genskow, Jesse Shapiro in 2010, make the point that the 2 parties, Democrats and Republicans, speak in essentially different languages. I'll illustrate the idea in a moment. And so the idea is we can feed speeches on Republicans and Democrat congressmen, this is what they do, to a computer which learns what a Republican and what a Democrat sounds like. And then partisanship, their measure of partisanship, becomes how accurately / quickly can the computer identify the correct party of the speaker. Think about it like the old Name That Tune game show, right? If you can figure out by how someone's talking really quickly that they're a Democrat or they're a Republican, they're likely quite partisan in their language. Okay, so what do we mean by partisan language? So here are the key partisan phrases that come out per decade that Genskow and Shapiro find. So for example, if you use the term death tax, so in the 2000s, death tax was a very partisan, these are called bigrams. Death tax was a very partisan bigram, right? You're much more likely to be a Republican than a Democrat, right? Republicans use this term a lot more than Democrats use this term. Democrats would more likely use the term estate tax, right? Republicans more likely, when you hear the word death tax, that's a pretty strong signal the person speaking it is a Republican. In the 1990s, if you use the term partial birth abortion, that bigram, more likely you're a Republican than a Democrat. In the 2010s, if you use the term climate change, more likely you're a Democrat than a Republican. So these bigrams, these terms are clues about the partisan identity of the speaker. So that's Genskow and Shapiro's point, is we can figure out, language can be a way in which we can identify who's a Democrat and who's a Republican. And a cool measure of partisanship is how quickly can I figure out you're a Republican versus a Democrat. And so that was their measure of partisanship in their paper. This is a paper, this is Genskow, Shapiro, and Taddy in 2019. They go back to congressional sessions in the late 1800s and apply this approach. And essentially the takeaway from their paper is that partisanship, at least measured by language, recently has become a lot higher. It started growing here in the 1990s, continued to grow in the 2000s, and has become quite high in the most recent period. Compared to the late 1800s all the way through the 1980s, when you hear somebody talk, they don't give really strong clues in the language that they use that they're a member of one party or another. Okay? So this is the really cool idea that we can identify somebody's party via their language. And then we can measure partisanship by how quickly we can tell which party you're a member of. All right, so I want to talk about two papers that use this approach. Correlation language measured equity. Right. So the question is about equity markets. In the chat,
just before you leave it,
sure.
Can I ask just one question?
Absolutely, please go for it.
Just on the partisans, an intuitive explanation for this would be that everybody is more and more applied to certain echo chambers. To what extent do you think that is the reasoning?
I think it's some combination of echo chambers. You're exactly right, and I would say the careful crafting of language by political campaigns, right? That using certain key words that they screen test, they focus group test, and figure out are quite resonant to their tribe.
Thanks.
So yes,
I didn't want to sidetrack you, but thanks. That explains
I think that's definitely part of it. There's a lot more of that going on today than in the late 1800s. I think is your point, right? Yeah. All right, so I want to talk about two papers which are going to use this language-based approach, two papers of mine. The first, the chat was asking about equities. The first applies this language-based approach to views on equities through the COVID pandemic. That's going to be the first paper. And then the second paper is going to use this approach to financial regulators, SEC commissioners, and Fed governors. That's particularly interesting, we think, because those are groups that aren't supposed to be partisan, right? In fact, there are a lot of institutional features at the SEC and the Fed that are meant to shield those groups from partisanship. So it is going to be interesting to see whether sort of partisanship has spilled into those groups, given we have this strong desire to keep them independent and not be influenced by partisanship. Okay, so let's first talk about paper one. Does partisanship shape investor beliefs? So what we do is we use that same Genskow and Shapiro language-based approach to identify the partisanship of investors, so their views of equities. Our setting is the social networking platform StockTwits. I think I gave a talk to this group before, my paper called Echo Chambers, that use this same setting. So this is StockTwits. StockTwits you can think of as like Twitter for traders and investors. We have data on about 350,000 users on this site. They have about 40 million tweets. Now, what's interesting about those tweets is the majority of them talk about investing, stock picking, and so on. But some of them talk about anything, like politics. And so what we're going to use is their random tweets about political views to identify people as Republicans or not. Okay, and then we're going to ask whether partisanship affects the ones that are identified as Republicans, their beliefs versus everybody else. And now you're going to ask, how come we didn't do the same for Democrats? In the paper, we do. It turns out there's just a lot fewer Democrats on StockTwits than there are Republicans. So the main analysis has Republicans and everyone else, but this is just a data issue. There are just not that many Democrats on StockTwits, as it turns out. Okay, so we're going to ask whether partisanship affects investor beliefs with a particular attention to the COVID crisis. We're going to find it does. And again, I think it's surprising given finance theory, right? And again, when I teach a class, when thinking about valuing a stock, we should think about its future cash flows, discount them today to get a value. If we're thinking about the value of the stock through COVID, right, you want to think about how COVID will affect that stock, right? Forecast out its cash flows given COVID, given potential government action, given potential, a vaccine innovation, so on and so forth. All of that, in principle, should be independent of my political party. So I think the result is surprising that, again, partisanship seems to be spilling into this corner of the universe. All right, so let's talk about what StockTwits looks like for those of you who weren't on the echo chambers discussion. So StockTwits, again, think about just Twitter for stocks. Here's what the interface looks like. You can type your tweet here, and then critically, you can slide this slider either to the left or to the right to identify whether you're bullish about the stock or stocks you're talking about. So for example, here's a user called Todd Sullivan. Here's one of his posts, which is in our sample. He's talking about the stock TPL, right? And he marks his view of TPL as bullish. And of course, when you read his tweet, you can see it's quite bullish as well. Okay. So how do we assign political parties on StockTwits? We use, here are some examples of the Republican identifying terms on StockTwits that we identify. So for example, if somebody uses the bigram Trump derangement as part of Trump derangement syndrome, more likely they're a Republican. If they use the term crooked Hillary, Russia hoax, liberal media, Obama, that's a kind of a funny one. Those are party identifying. This person is more likely to be a Republican. And these are some of the terms that came out. So we identify Republicans as either posters with this language or users that like posts with this language. And this next slide is a bit technical, and then I'll get to just one more slide which summarizes the paper. But here's what we do. We run regressions where we try and predict the likelihood that an individual user will be bullish. Okay, so we're trying to predict whether they're going to be bullish, and those regressions are going to have dummy variables for each date. Okay. The coefficients on the dummy variables reveal how relatively bullish people are feeling on that date. Okay. So for example, in general, the coefficients on dummy variables during COVID were lower. People unconditionally, across the entire sample, were less bullish about equities during COVID, as it turns out. Okay. But the key here is we have separate dummy variables for Republicans and everyone else, so we can identify how much more or less bullish Republicans feel on each date. Okay, so that's sort of the technical econometric background for what I'm going to show you. So I'm plotting these coefficients through time. And we're going to go all the way from February 2015 here on the far left, all the way through April 2020 here on the far right. This is when our sample stops in April 2020. Bob had asked, which is a good question, how come we didn't continue it longer? We stopped it in April 2020 because we were trying to write the paper quickly and submit it for a deadline, which was June 2020. This paper was ultimately published in 2020. It's the fastest paper I've ever written. So that's why the sample stops here in April 2020. But here's essentially the big picture takeaway. So before, I would say, late 2016, right, Republicans here in the dotted red and the everyone else group here in the solid black, they roughly tracked each other. Now, the Republicans are a lot more bumpy because there are a lot fewer of them. So it's a noisier series for sure. But I would say in general, these two series were moving in the same direction, okay, before late 2016. Then once Trump was elected, so this would be November 2016, these two series start to come apart. Okay, so Republicans become relatively more optimistic about equities on StockTwits relative to the baseline group. During Trump's trade war with China, I would say these two series continue to spread apart. And then probably the biggest move in the series is this last one. You can see everyone else becomes much more pessimistic about equities. This is this move down here at the bottom right. I hope none of the blocks are blocking this. None of the waffle squares are blocking this. This group becomes much more pessimistic about equities. And essentially the Republican group is not phased by the onset of COVID. This is starting in, so this is February, March, and April of 2020. Okay. So it looks like, this looks like evidence that people's partisanship affects how they viewed equities through the Trump administration. And again, the biggest difference here came on the onset of COVID in late 2020. Okay. All right, I'll stop there. Any questions on this? I'm going to move on to the next paper. Any questions or thoughts on this?
Yeah. Hey, Joey, just one from Nelly in the chat. StockTwits is majority Republican, then de facto the data analysis will be skewed. But did you say there's fewer Republicans on StockTwits? That's why what's the ratio?
Yeah. So I would say there are not that many identifiable partisans, either Republicans or Democrats on StockTwits. So this baseline category here, it doesn't have any partisan tweets. And this is the vast majority of who's on StockTwits. So I would say our evidence is that people on StockTwits, there are definitely more Republicans than Democrats, but the majority of them don't express any political opinions. So we just compare Republicans to everyone else. There is a version of our paper where we compare the Republicans on StockTwits to the Democrats. It's just that Democrat series is so noisy because there are so much fewer of them. But I think the difference is still valid, right? Here's the Republican group on StockTwits. Here are people that don't sound like Republicans. They don't sound like Democrats either, right? So we could think, there might be some, this group could lean Republican. This group is certainly Republican. This group could lean Republican, but there are probably plenty of independents and Democrats in this group too. We just don't know because they don't have any political tweets. And yet you can see this big difference between the Republicans on StockTwits and everyone else, which might include some Republicans. Again, none of them that are vocal enough on StockTwits to self-identify, essentially.
Hey, Joey, a couple things. If I'm in your thunder, say, Bob, relax, I'm going to get to that. But maybe we're showing two things here. One, kind of syncing up with that paper that I shared on entrepreneurship. You see when Trump is elected, Republicans are more optimistic about the market.
And I'm going to get to that. I'm definitely going to get to that.
And I just shared with you, like last week, an article that I had seen, I think in Bloomberg, about Democrats feeling more optimistic about the economy. And to me, that was because they're looking at Kamala Harris as far more electable than Biden after his disastrous debate performance.
Sure.
So kind of
sure. So maybe let's just skip to it because I do want to keep this casual, and this is a good time. And then I'll go back. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I just ask one question, because if you go back to that chart, so that really just shows the Trump period. And I read your paper, so I know you cover all the other periods. But did you see the polar opposite during the Obama and the Biden, or the previous Bush and Clinton?
Yeah. So for the other papers I'm going to talk, for two of the other papers I'm going to talk about, you do see the opposite in the Democrat periods. This paper was just in this period. And again, we didn't. The StockTwits data don't go as far back as Obama, unfortunately. I'm not even sure StockTwits was around. They could have been, or they weren't. It wasn't around when Obama got elected, so we can't do sort of the experiment right around when Obama was elected. But yes, for the other papers I'm going to describe, we're going to look at what happens right around Obama's election and right around Trump's election. Those are going to be the two comparisons. So yes, and you do see the opposites. Yes. Yeah. But let me jump to what Bob was saying about views of the economy. So I was eventually going to get there, but since you brought it up, now is probably a good time to get there. So what I'm showing you is something called the Bloomberg Consumer Comfort Index. So Bloomberg asks a group via survey whether they have a positive view of the economy. Okay, and what I'm plotting for you is the percent Democrat minus the percent Republican that report they have a positive view of the economy. And I'm showing you as far back as it goes and as far forward as it goes. So This goes through multiple changes, multiple party changes. So here's the 1992 election, which went from Bush to Clinton. Here's Clinton to the younger Bush. Here's the younger Bush to Obama, Obama to Trump, Trump to Biden. So those are these dotted lines for the party changing elections. And what you see is, and I think this is what Bob was referring to, especially lately, you see sharp changes in Democrat minus Republican, right? Because think of this as a difference between the two. So for example, just to give you a data point here, this minus 30%, right, would mean like, for example, 70% of Republicans reported they were optimistic about the economy and only 40% of Democrats did. 40% minus 70%, that's how you get this minus 30, right? Okay, so you see sharp changes in this plot around party changing elections, right? So Bob was talking about Trump, right? So you saw, and Bob was saying even a little bit before Trump, like there was some anticipation. I think that's what Bob was referring to with respect to his commentary on Kamala Harris, right? If Democrats are anticipating Harris might be the next president, they start becoming now a little bit more optimistic. So you do see a little bit of anticipation as well. This is quarterly data, so you see a little bit of it. Anyway, but I mean, the big moves are at the election, right? Huge swings, right? When Trump was elected, huge swing in the opposite direction when Biden is elected. In fact, Ben Bernanke remarked on this with respect to Trump's election. This is from him writing in the New York Times. There's a kind of partisan coloring, which is really striking. The election result completely reversed people's view of the state of the economy. Republicans who thought we were in a dystopia now think things look great, and Democrats the opposite. And it shows that it isn't all based on an objective assessment of the economy. So I think this is the fact that Bob is referring to, which I'm definitely going to use for the final two papers I talk about. Let me talk about the regulator paper first, which uses the language-based approach. So let me go there next, and then I'll talk about those last two papers. So in paper number 2, so this is the Partisanship of Financial Regulators, we use the same Genskow and Shapiro language-based approach to identify the partisanship of regulators, financial regulators. Our setting is going to be the SEC and the Fed. So SEC commissioners and Fed governors. Again, both the SEC and the Fed have features that are meant to shield them from partisanship. So for example, Fed governors can't be discharged for the policy that they make. Elected officials can't serve on the Fed board. Fed funding doesn't come from Congress. The SEC doesn't report to the White House. SEC commissioners can't be removed without cause, just because they voted in a way someone doesn't like. And no more than 3 of the 5 SEC commissioners can belong to the same political party. In fact, the quote that we lead our paper with is this quote from an SEC commissioner, a former SEC commissioner. So this is what A.A. Summer Jr. said in a 1996 speech. So he was SEC commissioner between 1973 and 1976. He said, had anyone sat through every meeting while I was on the commission, that person could never have told which of the commissioners were Republicans and which were Democrats. And so he's making the point. You could listen to us talk, in the mid 70s, you would not be able to tell who's the Republican and who's the Democrat. This is sort of the value of an independent SEC set of commissioners. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that Genskow and Shapiro language approach to first identify partisan phrases among congressmen. So we know they're Republicans and Democrats. So those are the exact phrases I showed you before. Things like, things like climate change and death tax, right? So we know what the partisan phrases look like. And then we're going to examine the speeches of SEC commissioners and Fed governors and see how often they use these partisan words. So you can think about our paper as essentially asking, to what extent do financial regulators sound like politicians? Right? We know politicians use words like death tax, climate change, and so on. To what extent do we see SEC commissioners and Fed governors using this language? And we're going to do it decade by decade over time, starting in the 1930s, and see whether partisanship has changed at the Fed and at the SEC, again, as measured by language over time. Now, just to give you an example, so how is this methodology going to work? Here's a speech by Commissioner Louis Aguilar. This is in 2010. And you can see this speech is replete with some of that partisan language. He uses, for example, climate change. Here's another one I missed, at least 4 times in the first 4 paragraphs. Okay. Now, regardless of how you feel about climate change, this is going to be a partisan identifying phrase. This is going to help me identify that the speaker is very likely a Democrat, right? That's what the analysis I showed you before showed. And so Luis Aguilar is indeed a Democrat. So if he uses this phrase a lot, I'm going to be able to more easily identify that he indeed is also a Democrat. Okay. All right, so what are the results? We find no partisanship trend among Fed governors over time. Okay, so here's what the plot looks like for the Fed over time. Definitely see some bumps up and down, but in general, if we were going to fit a regression line through this, in general, it's pretty flat through time, from the 30s all the way through into the last decade we examined, which is 2010 through 2020. Okay, so the Fed there doesn't seem to be evidence that the Fed has been infiltrated by this recent upswing in partisanship that we've been talking about since the beginning of this meeting. Not true at the SEC. Okay? So SEC commissioners are increasingly sounding like politicians. Okay? And this trend has started really in the 2000s and then continued up from the period 2010 through 2020. It would be interesting to see what happens from 2020 to 2030 and so on. Again, we haven't lived those years yet, but it would be very interesting to see whether this trend continues. Now, in terms of mapping this graph to interpretation, here's how you can think about it. So putting what I just showed you in words, in the 1990s, if you listen to an SEC commissioner speak for 1 minute, you could guess his or her party with about 51% accuracy. So it's basically a coin flip. Basically, in that minute, there aren't that many hints about which side he or she is affiliated with. In the 2000s, you could guess it with 54% accuracy, so a little bit better with just 1 minute of speech. In the 2010s, this is up to 63%. Okay. So again, think of this akin to like name that tune. In the 2010s, it takes fewer words, fewer phrases for me to become somewhat accurate in correctly identifying the party of the SEC commissioner. And then again, I don't have time to get into all of the paper, but we also find evidence of increasing partisanship among SEC commissioners via their voting. So the voting data, unfortunately, we only have back to 2006. There's a long story, but we did a bunch of FOIA requests and we got blocked from the pre-2006 data. So we only have it back through 2006. But from 2006 on, you can definitely see this trend in voting of SEC commissioners. Number one, you see a lot more dissents in the voting now in recent times. So again, if everyone's on the same page when they vote on an issue, there won't be people that dissent, right? Everyone will agree. Okay? You see a lot more dissents in the more recent period. And again, a more measure of partisanship conditional on there being a dissent of at least of 2 people. So when there's a 3-2 vote, the chance that those 2 are a member of the same party is way higher than it would be if there was no partisanship, right? If people were just all independent thinkers and 2 people dissented, equally likely they're Republican or Democrat, right? Not exactly equally likely because there's 3-2, but you get the idea. But we find that they're the same party over 95% of the time. Okay? So it looks like there's increasing partisanship in the way they vote as well. Again, I didn't have a lot of time to talk about it, but that is also in the paper.
Hey,
Let me pause here before I move on to the next paper, see if there are any other questions.
Yeah, Joey, with the data that you do have for their speeches, looks like it goes back to what, the 30s?
The 30s, yeah.
Ends where?
It ends in 2020.
2020. Okay, so that one chart you showed is actually the 2010s through.
The 2010s meaning, right, 2010 through 2020. Technically, it's 2011 through 2020, but yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I
I
have
see
a
there.
comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's not very sort of scientific or financial, I guess. But if you think about the United States culture and like the Phil Donahues of the world and this idea of expressing yourself, if I think about the UK culture and in Europe, where sort of debate is allowed in the House of Commons, but it's confined. You don't really have, or traditionally you haven't had a social platform where you can dissent or you can have a voice like a Twitter or StockTwits. And I wonder if the sort of the Phil Donahue movement that then turned into, right, this idea that anyone can express their view and or share their feelings, whether they're bullish or not, is that, do you think there's merit to that?
I think there could be. So I think maybe your point is it could be that sort of in people's hearts there was always as much sort of polarization over time, but it's just being expressed more. That could be, and perhaps it's being expressed more because sort of allowed to be expressed more culturally, because the culture has changed over time. It's definitely possible. And it'll be hard to know sort of the difference between sort of what people genuinely feel in their heart versus what they express. We can only see what they express over time. I mean, that is one nice thing we're keeping for like the SEC commissioners and the Fed governors. We're keeping the domain the same, right? So SEC commissioners, Fed governors, they've been giving speeches since the 1930s. So we're sort of fixing the domain, them going somewhere and giving a speech, right? That is being fixed over time, and we're just seeing whether the language becomes more partisan. But yeah, there could be some difference between what people feel like they can say over time. And so the actual amount of polarization sort of in people's hearts has remained the same, but the expression of it has just increased over time. So it's possible. Yeah. All right. And then I saw in the chat, so StockTwits launched in 2008. Yes. And so unfortunately, we wouldn't have scope to do like before versus after 2008. And the data that goes back even close to 2008, I don't think we have any data in 2008, but really far back data. I think we might have data back to 2010. StockTwits was so unpopular back then, there's barely any data. Unfortunately, StockTwits has become much more verbose. There's lots of talking and tweeting on StockTwits within the last 10 years. And then how about the last decade, 2010 to 2023? So the 2010s is 2011 through 2020. I agree. It would be very interesting to see what happens going forward. Whether this trend among SEC committee, if we just keep on going with the trend, whether it becomes even higher. That would be very interesting to see. I hope someone performs a follow-on study and answers the question. All right, so I've already talked to you about this changing economic expectations around party changing elections. So this is going to be the main fact that I'm going to use, and the next two papers are going to be downstream of it. The other thing I want to tell you about before I get to those papers is what makes those papers possible, which is new data that's become available to myself and other researchers in economics and finance. So just as a background, political campaigns buy data from political data vendors. I don't know if you've heard of them, but very famous ones like, well, not famous. The big players are Catalyst, TargetSmart, L2, Aristotle. These data vendors, what they do is they collect regularly voter rolls from all 50 states and DC. It's a pain to do. So if I tried to, I could ask the state of Washington for the voter rolls, ask Nebraska, ask Wyoming. Everyone has various requirements. Some are free, some are not. Some will send me a CD, some will send me a file. Like, it's very hard to do. It's laborious. So it's a great service that these political data vendors do to separately collect the voter rolls from every state, because as you know, states run their elections independently, right? There's no central mechanism which coordinates all the voter rolls across states. So they get the voter rolls from each state and DC. They clean them because they're definitely data errors, and then they add on a lot of variables that campaigns would probably like. You know, things like, have you donated to a campaign before? Are you a member of the NRA? And things like that. Because the political campaigns will use these data sets to say, all right, I want Republicans who are NRA members, I'm going to target them for this particular bill, which is coming up, or this particular vote, which is coming up, right? So essentially, think of this database as all voters in the US with a bunch of variables added on that political campaigns would like to see. For our purposes, what's really important is it has a list of all registered voters in the US and their affiliation: Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green Party, so on and so forth. Okay. And so recently, these political data vendors have been selling this data to finance researchers. And so now, for the first time, we can examine individual decisions of Republicans and Democrats. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about two papers. One is called Partisan Entrepreneurship, and the other is called Political Sentiment and Innovation. Okay. So let me talk about the first one, which Bob briefly mentioned. So what we do is we examine the entrepreneurship of Republicans and Democrats around the party-changing elections of Obama, so this is 2008, and Trump, this is 2016. And so here, the big picture idea is, do we see the rate of Democrat minus Republican entrepreneurship follow that change in Democrat minus Republican optimism around these party-changing elections? So, going back to this picture, if it's true that after Obama is elected here, a lot more Democrats become excited about the economy, does that mean there's more Democrat entrepreneurship relative to Republican entrepreneurship? Likewise, at this move here, right, when Republicans become a lot more excited about the prospects of the economy, is it going to be true that Republicans start more firms relative to Democrats? Okay. And the answer is going to be yes. Okay. And I'll show you that in a moment. Back here, so we're going to merge a database of all voter registrations, about 200 million. We get that from L2, one of these political data vendors, with a database of all new business registrations. This comes from a data set called the Startup Cartography Project. Again, if you're interested in this data set, details are in the paper. And I think zooming out, there are two headline results that are new to the literature. Number one, and this may not surprise you, unconditionally, so forgetting about what regime we're in, the Obama regime, the Trump regime, unconditionally, Republicans start more businesses than Democrats. Okay, so in our sample, which runs from 2005 through 2017, 4% of Democrats, 6% of Republicans started a business. Okay, so Republicans are starting more businesses than Democrats. However, that spread, right? You can think of the rate of Democrats starting a business minus the rate of Republicans starting businesses. That spread, right, went up during the Obama administration. In other words, that 4% minus 6% shrank a little bit during the Obama administration. Republicans are still starting more businesses, but less so. Okay? And it expanded during the Trump administration, right? So there were considerably more Republicans starting businesses than Democrats during the Trump administration. This change, this movement in the spread, we estimate amounts to a reallocation of about 13,000 firms a year. 13,000 Democrat rather than Republican firms, or Republican rather than Democrat firms per year, depending on the regime that's in charge, right? Depending on whether it's the Obama administration or the Trump administration. This adds up to about 170,000 firms during our period. Think about a partisan reallocation of about 170,000 firms, which is about how many firms started in the entire state of Mississippi during our sample period, just to give you some sense of economic magnitude. Okay. And perhaps most convincingly, this difference in startup rates shows up almost immediately after the election. So just like if we go back to this graph, just like the changes in expectations about the economy or views about the economy change right around the election, pretty sharp around the election, here, the more recent election here, we see startup rates change really quickly around the party changing election. So let me show that to you. So again, these are coefficients from a regression, which I don't want to get into the details of, but essentially think of this as the Democrat minus Republican startup rate, which is relatively flat. These are quarters around the 2008 election of Obama, which is relatively flat. Okay? And then after Obama is elected, becomes elevated. So this is saying the Democrat minus Republican startup rate is increasing around Obama's election, and it is decreasing around Trump's election. Okay, so this is saying, all right, now Dem minus Rep is becoming more negative around Trump's election. Yeah. So that is again big picture paper number 3, and then the last paper. I'll do this one quickly and then just stop for just general discussion at the end. We can take that same approach and apply it to patenters. So in the last paper, Political Sentiment and Innovation, we examined the innovation activity of Republican and Democrat patenters around those same 2 elections, Obama and Trump. It's the similar idea as before, but just applied to patenters. So just like entrepreneurs care about the economic environment when they create a new business, patenters should care about the economic environment when they innovate or invent. So we merge our database of voter registrations with the USPTO, the United States Patent and Trademark Office database. This is a database of all patents that are applied for, and then there's another database of ones that are ultimately granted. We're going to do patent applications. Okay. And we're going to find that the probability of filing a patent increases for Democrat patenters after Obama's election and decreases after Trump's. And the opposite is true for Republican patenters. And again, very similar pictures around the election of Obama and the election of Trump. Again, because it's just a very similar idea applied to patenting rather than starting a business. I won't take more time because I want to leave time for discussion. But let me just end here, and then again, love to have a discussion. I think the big picture takeaway is that number one, levels of political partisanship are at all-time highs via a variety of measures. Finance research has become more interested because it seems to influence beliefs and outcomes that we care about. So for example, Republicans were more optimistic about equities when COVID hit. SEC commissioners are sounding a lot more like politicians during the last decade. Fed governors are not. And the difference between Democrat and Republican entrepreneurship and innovation rises during Democrat regimes and falls during Republican ones. And I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Joey, thank you. I've got a couple, but I'll put those on pause and
Sure.
Just as you did, open it up to the floor to see if you've got questions from board members or guests. Anybody?
Barry Gilman. I could ask a quick question. Sorry, my camera is not working.
Oh, no worries. Go for it.
In terms of these most recent ideas, these papers, very interesting. Have you thought about, or would it be possible to do the same sort of study looking at the different AI models as to whether they are politically biased just by what answers they give to the same questions?
You could absolutely do that. You could absolutely do that. I don't know whether people like in computer science are on that, but you could absolutely do that. You could look at, again, you could take a language-based approach, right? When you ask, let's say, a chat bot a question, if they use a lot more party identifying language on one side versus another, you could identify the chat bot as essentially more likely to be a Democrat or Republican. You absolutely could do that.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you.
That'd be very interesting. Yeah, very cool idea.
I have a question, not necessarily on what you presented. That's really fascinating, and to see the data so clearly show up, saying the partnership is at all-time highs. The couple of topics I'm kind of interested in, either whether you have looked into or if you're aware other people have looked into, is the partnership's impact on U.S. industrial policy as well as its effectiveness on industrial policy, and the same apply to trade policy. And another part, I don't know how one can structure research, but on education, because I think the education relates to a country's human capital, and that has been unfortunately deteriorating. But anyhow, so I'm kind of curious if that's like whether you or someone else might be broadening that framework to examine the impact on those.
So for the first one, for industrial policy, the answer is no, not that I know of. For the second one, trade, that's really interesting. The closest paper I can think of, it's not exactly, but I bet it's correlated with this idea. There's a paper which uses a survey called I think it's called the Eurobarometer survey. And essentially think about that survey as measuring how much trust there is across countries. So they'll ask Italians, how much do you trust Germans? Italians, how much do you trust people from Britain? Italians, how much do you trust people from Italy, right? They'll measure trust, either same country trust, and then trust across these various countries, right? And what the paper does is it looks at whether trade follows where there are more trust linkages. So for example, if Italians don't trust Germans, do we see a lot less trade between Italy and Germany? But if, Germany trusts the Austrians, do we see a lot of trade between Germany and Austria? And the answer is yes. There seems to be more trade, which corresponds to trust according to the Eurobarometer survey. And where I'm going with this is, I would guess trust is going to be correlated with political orientation. Countries which are more conservative might trust other conservative countries more. Countries which are more liberal might trust other liberal countries more. That's just my guess. Again, I don't know that for sure, but that's just my guess. But that's the closest I've seen to it. And then your third area, which is
education. I'm really curious.
Yeah, education. Nothing springs to mind, but I agree it would be interesting, and something I could take a look at. I can't think of anything in the literature. The only one that popped out was the second one with respect to trade. But I mean, you could do versions of the trade example within the U.S. Think about sort of business to business interactions within the U.S. Right? They're owners of the business. They're either going to be Republicans or Democrats, according to the big voter database that I have. You can see whether there's more, trade business in between individuals that are of the same party versus cross party, and whether that is sort of waned through time as we increasingly don't like each other on the other party side, whether there's less trade among those groups. That would be interesting, I think, to look at. I haven't seen that. It's a good idea.
I'm thinking like trade and including volume and trade barriers in both tariffs and sanctions.
Both would be interesting. I agree. Totally agree.
Yeah. Right. I'm like kind of curious, like whether it could be just partisan, Democrat or Republican, or it could be actually the variable is the gap, the partnership gap. Like if that is the measurement, I'm kind of, like maybe the barriers is I don't know. It will be interesting to see the data.
But what I think if you did volume, which was the first thing you said, volume should essentially be downstream of barriers, right? So if I put up a lot of barriers between this Republican county and this Democrat county, right, trade barriers, however they manifest, we shouldn't see a lot of trade in between them. So I think if you went just to volume in the analysis, I think that'd be really interesting, and I haven't seen it. But yeah, very nice idea.
Any other questions for Joey?
Just one question regarding this Bloomberg Consumer Confidence indicator that you were showing. Once that we have this political noise that it is affecting it, would you say that it is a less reliable leading indicator for the economy now? Because we have some respondents there. It's this kind of indicator that every time that it's published, it moves the market. But now there is some more noise.
No, I totally agree. If you were an econometrician working with this data, you might want to sort of net out the partisan effect, right? When using the data, right? Because I think your point is, if suppose we happen to survey a lot more Democrats, in 2022 under a Democrat administration, we might get a more positive view of the economy. Well, that's just because of the affiliation of the group we happen to survey, right? So in some sense, we want to sort of net out that bias, right? So yes, it definitely can induce some more noise. And if you were a researcher sort of using this data, you might want to try and remove that and create some sort of residualized measure, right? After taking out this effect, here's a better estimate of economic views, the population's overall view, positiveness or negativeness of the economy. I totally agree.
Hey, Joey, on that,
Thank you.
Alex's question kind of reminds me, are these measures of partisanship and their effect on, things like the Bloomberg Consumer Comfort Index, are they more highly correlated than some of the traditional demographic measures? Because I think about, like, as an economist, I might look at age, gender, income bracket to get a sense of, okay, wealthy people think the economy is doing better, but now are those less informative relative to partisanship? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the formal way you would do it is, if you had the data, let's say, let's say there are 10,000 respondents, you knew whether they're Republican, Democrat, male, female, their age, right? You would want to run a regression where you're predicting, their view, either positive, are you positive about the economy or not? And then you would want to have a dummy for, Republican, age dummies, gender dummies, and so on, and see, after netting out the age effects, the gender effects, is there still a Republican Democrat effect? I haven't run that regression. My sense is there definitely would be. And my sense of that comes from, I think we might have had this discussion in your office. I don't have this picture, but I can send it to you. Over time, when Pew asked these sort of value surveys, they've been asking it over time, what they found is the strongest predictor of your answer to these value surveys is increasingly becoming your political party.
Yeah.
So, like in 1994, political part for how you answer value-based questions, your political party was just about as important as your religious affiliation or your gender or your age. But now it has become the dominant predictor of how you're going to answer these value-based surveys. So it's increasingly becoming that characteristic, which is most predictable, most predictive, I should say, of answers, again, to these value-based surveys. So I'm going to guess it's going to be the characteristic which is very important for answering this one as well, whether you're optimistic about the economy or not. That's just my guess, but I haven't run that regression. That is what you would want to do, though.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I got one more, but any other questions from the group?
Again, this is I'm as I look at this, I'm thinking on another topic that that I kind of spend a lot of time, that is the kind of long-term strategic planning. And one of the critique I heard regarding US, actually the origins probably from Henry Kissinger, is saying that in a lot of earlier asked about industrial, you can also say about the military, the lack of infrastructure, long-term planning. And I wonder, I mean, just intuitively, that lack the division itself might be a key barrier for that. And if that does have close correlation, then the current state, if the partisanship is so strong, then it definitely isn't that optimistic. Anyhow, so it's a little bit more commentary thought I'm interested in hearing your view and potentially others' view.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I don't have anything to add. Very, very interesting thought.
Any other questions? The only other one that comes to mind, Joe, you kind of touched on this a little bit with the Eurobarometer survey. Have you seen these types of studies applied to countries outside the United States?
Yeah, the Eurobarometer one, I believe, is just European countries. And that's again, that's not partisanship. That's bilateral trust, right, between countries, and whether that trust, whether trade essentially follows the trust as measured by that Eurobarometer survey. Have I seen partisanship research in other countries? I believe there is a study. One that comes to mind is one, I believe it's using Brazilian data that shows partisanship affecting hiring. So like the analog here in the US would be, suppose I'm a Republican manager and I'm going to go hire an employee, and I have two otherwise, at least on paper, identical employees. I'm more likely to hire my same party employee. And later on, when I go to fire someone, I'm more likely to fire the opposite party employee. That study came out of Brazil. That one pops to mind. But I would say the majority of this research is using US data. I can't tell if that's because people view there being a higher level of partisanship in the US, so we would expect to find more effects here, or because the data is just very good here. Again, access to that political data, the data from political data vendors, has just been sort of a revolution in economics and finance over the last 10 years. We just haven't had access to that data, and now the political data vendors are selling it to us. I can't tell if that's a data advantage or people think ex ante we're going to be a lot more partisan here in the US.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Any other questions?
Could I ask just one question? So I had seen, this is back in 2019, a professor from Northwestern had come and spoke at she had spoken at Davidson College, and she had a chart. I'm looking at the chart right now, and it said that the share of there's an increasing number of independents from the period of 2004 through 2018. And I'm just going to read you the statistics over that period of time. She had the share of the public went from 31% to 43%. Independents from 2004 to 2018, while at the same time, the share of Republicans went from 34 down to 25%, and Democrats went from 34% down to 29%. So I just overlaying that on what you were finding, because Dr. Robert Cialdini, who wrote the book Influence, who is a PhD from Chapel Hill, he also said there's a difference between people's thoughts on policies versus how they vote from a political party perspective. So, and I use myself as an example. I might be very conservative on the economic policies, but I might be a little bit more liberal on my social policies.
Social policies, yeah.
Yeah. So just overlaying that, I mean, because these trends seem to say maybe people aren't as independent since 2018. Maybe that on the other way, and people are really going to the two sides, which it sure does feel like. But yet, I think when you look at things from a policy perspective, people seem to be you know, a little bit more independent, right? Because
Right.
nobody really 100% agrees with this side or 100% with that side, but then they like Cialdini says, they tend to vote which with every side, but their policy views tend to be more centric. But I'll just
Right.
just maybe overlay that into some of your thoughts.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about that. The trend is, I think a long time ago, it used to be about a third, Democrat, Republican, Independent. And to your point, a lot of, you read the statistics that that middle third, that independent, is becoming the dominant group in the U.S. I'll say from a data perspective, it's not great. Imagine, if 40 years from now, I buy the same database and everyone's an independent, then the sort of analysis I've been showing you is going to be a lot harder to do. From a language-based approach, it's not going to be a problem, right? If an independent uses the term crooked Hillary, or an independent uses the term death tax, I can still hopefully classify him or her one way or the other. But again, from a data point of view, that could make this sort of analysis challenging in the future. But my general sense, and I'd be curious what you all think, is the some of the parties have, there can be some negative connotation to being a member of some of the two polar parties over time. And so people might still have, maybe this was your point, people still might have Republican views or Democrat views, but in order not to be essentially flagged with this negative connotation, it's easier to register as an independent and then still vote according to your values, which are going to be either Republican or Democrat. Again, that's just speculation on my part. But as there have been an increasing sort of negative connotation to specific party membership, you can imagine people not wanting to be essentially tagged that way. So they can just be independent and then still vote according to their values. But again, sorry, my main reaction is in terms of being a researcher. If that trend continues, I'm not going to have as many Democrats and Republicans in my sample, right? Everyone's going to, there's going to be this large group in the middle, and it'll be harder to identify a big group of Republicans, how they behave versus a big group of Democrats.
Thank you. But I love what you're doing with the, it makes it's so intuitively perfect. You're just using people's words. To easily identify.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and again, not my innovation. That came from really two just really brilliant economists. But it's been cool to import into finance research and apply. You can think about importing it other places, right? We know we can essentially assign affiliation, for example, to Supreme Court justices, right, based on who appointed them. Have these sort of partisan phrases increasingly shown up in Supreme Court opinions, right? And could that be a measure of whether the Supreme Court has become more partisan over time? There are lots of applications of this idea, which, to your point, I think is pretty cool.
All right. Any other questions? Maybe one last chance here. Okay, we'll take that as a no. Joey, thank you so much for joining us, sharing your insights. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. Once I have a little clearer vision on our next meeting, could be a panel discussion on active and passive investing. I'll share more information about that in the future. So as always, hit me if you have any questions via email or just call me via phone. Joey, thanks again. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you again next time.